In late autumn of 1944, a phone call took place in the office of the Supreme Commander-in-Chief in Moscow, which predetermined the fate of one of Europe's most beautiful cities and hundreds of thousands of people. On the other end of the line was Marshal Rodion Yakovlevich Malinovsky, commander of the Second Ukrainian Front. The demand from the capital was categorical, harsh, and brooked not the slightest objection: to take the Hungarian capital on the move immediately, within the next few days. The Marshal, being at the front line and assessing the real tactical and logistical situation, perfectly understood the absolute impossibility of this task. His troops were utterly exhausted after a swift, grueling offensive across the entire territory of Romania. Supply lines stretched for hundreds of kilometers, and ahead lay a powerful, deeply echeloned defensive system built around a huge metropolis, divided by a wide and full-flowing river. However, in the harsh coordinate system of that time, the word underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, zero, underscore, underscore was equated with direct sabotage and treason. The front commander gave the order for an immediate offensive, thereby launching an irreversible chain of events that would lead to one of the longest, most exhausting, and controversial sieges of the second half of the global world conflict of the 20th century, as well as to a massive, unprecedented falsification that concealed the true state of affairs from the country's highest leadership. To understand the profound motives and inevitability of the subsequent decisions of the front command, it is necessary to examine in maximum detail the strategic landscape of Eastern Europe that had developed by the end of 1944. The offensive impulse of the Soviet armies drastically changed the political and military map of the entire region. Romania and Bulgaria, previously reliable allies of the Axis, under pressure of circumstances, changed their political course, overthrew former governments, and turned their weapons against former partners. Hungary remained Germany's last major strategic stronghold in Europe, its most important economic appendage, and the last barrier on the way to the southern borders of the Third Reich. What was even more critical for the exhausted German war machine was that this was where the last available oil fields in the Lake Balaton area were located, and a direct path to the industrial centers of Austria opened up. For the German High Command, holding Hungarian territory was a matter of absolute strategic survival. The loss of these lines would have meant the inevitable collapse of the entire southern flank of defense and the loss of critically important resources. The situation within Hungary itself during this period was characterized by extreme instability and resembled a boiling cauldron. The country's ruler, Regent Miklós Horthy, an experienced politician, realizing the inevitability of impending global geopolitical changes and not wishing to turn his homeland into a battlefield for the final battle, attempted to secretly withdraw the state from the conflict by beginning secret negotiations with the anti-Hitler coalition. These cautious intentions did not escape the close attention of German intelligence. In response, a lightning-fast and daring special operation was carried out. Special units neutralized the regent's guards, and his son was kidnapped as a hostage. Under threat of reprisals against his heir, Horthy was forced to abdicate. As a result of this coup, control over Budapest passed to the ultra-radical Arrow-Cross Party, led by the fanatical Ferenc Szalasi. The new puppet leadership immediately proclaimed a course for total mobilization of the population and the transformation of the entire country into a single, impregnable military camp. The capital was officially declared a fortress city, which was to be held by all available means, regardless of destruction and casualties. Around the megalopolis, months in advance, Through the heavy physical labor of engineers and mobilized citizens, a deeply echeloned system of fortifications was erected, codenamed Margarita Line. It consisted of tens of kilometers of anti-tank ditches, continuous minefields, camouflaged reinforced concrete bunkers, and carefully equipped artillery positions, masterfully integrated into the complex natural terrain of the surrounding area. It was against these impregnable lines, bristling with steel and concrete, that the first hasty blow of Soviet troops fell in early November. Fulfilling an unequivocal directive from Moscow, advanced divisions attempted to break through the defenses on a narrow sector and burst into the eastern part of the city, Pest, located on the flat left bank of the Danube. The staff officers' calculations relied solely on the factor of surprise, speed, and the successful experience of previous operations in the Balkan Peninsula, where major European capitals surrendered without prolonged, destructive resistance. But the approaches to Budapest became an absolutely insurmountable obstacle for the exhausted units. German and Hungarian units loyal to the new regime, relying on pre-prepared positions, offered unprecedentedly tough, disciplined resistance. The offensive immediately bogged down. Tank wedges, deprived of proper infantry support, became mired in wide anti-tank ditches and came under crossfire, destructive heavy anti-tank artillery. The attempt to take the megalopolis on the fly, on ambition alone, failed miserably, leading to a serious depletion of the offensive potential of the strike groups and the loss of precious time. A critical existential problem, extending far beyond purely military planning and tactics, arose before the front headquarters. It was necessary to urgently report to the Supreme Commander-in-Chief the real reasons for the halt of the swift offensive and the actual failure to execute a direct, personal order. In conditions of an extremely rigid power hierarchy, where suspicion reigned and the principle of the strictest personal responsibility applied, the price of such an error for a commander of such high rank was truly enormous. Direct admission of one's own tactical miscalculations, underestimation of enemy forces, poor reconnaissance, or extreme exhaustion of entrusted troops could lead to immediate, ignominious dismissal, a tribunal, and far more severe disciplinary consequences. There arose an acute, vital need to find the most objective, undeniable, and solid justification for the Army's prolonged stagnation and the impossibility of rapid advance through enemy fortifications. It was at this critical, pivotal moment that a parallel paper reality began to form in the official reports, sent daily to the capital via closed communication channels. To justify the colossal difficulties of advancement and the huge daily losses of equipment, the front headquarters made an unspoken decision to radically revise upwards the estimates of the enemy's opposing force. According to modern, meticulous historical research, based on a cross-study of declassified archival documents of both conflicting parties, the actual strength of the combined German-Hungarian garrison, which eventually found itself trapped in the siege ring, ranged from 70 to 90,000 people. This number included not only regular combat units, but also numerous auxiliary services, rear units, anti-aircraft gunners, as well as hastily armed detachments of city militia and police. However, in the reports that landed on the desk in Moscow, this modest figure began to grow rapidly, unnaturally. Initially, it easily surpasses the psychological mark of 100,000. Then, in a matter of weeks, reaches 150,000, and finally is definitively fixed in official documents at a record level of 188,000 enemy servicemen. This statistical leap was not a simple arithmetic error, a mistake by tired intelligence analysts, or the result of a data transmission failure. The twofold, deliberate overestimation of enemy forces was a deeply conscious administrative mechanism for the self-preservation of the front's high command. The presence of an almost 200,000-strong, deeply echeloned, perfectly armed, and fanatically motivated army before the advancing troops ideally, without unnecessary questions, explained any temporary delays. Such a monumental threat justified the highest rates of artillery shell and fuel consumption and legitimized constant demands for the urgent involvement of additional strategic reserves from the rear. In the perverted logic of this distorted system of coordinates, slow, agonizing progress became not a sign of the commander's tactical impotence, but undeniable evidence of the heaviest, heroic overcoming of vastly superior enemy forces. The skillful lie became a reliable protective screen, an impenetrable bureaucratic armor, behind which strategic miscalculations and the haste of the very initial stage of the offensive operation were reliably hidden. As the steel encirclement around the huge metropolis finally closed in the last days of December 1944, the nature of the military confrontation radically changed. The war of engines and large-scale maneuvers in the open field transitioned into a grim phase of an exhausting, merciless urban siege, which would last more than 50 long, cold days. Budapest represented a complex, multi-level theater of operations, a real architectural nightmare for any advancing army. If the eastern part, Pest, was characterized by dense but geometrically regular development with wide, straight avenues, then the western historical part, Buda, was a true bastion created by nature itself. Steep, icy hills, narrow medieval winding streets, massive stone buildings of the historic center whose wall thickness reached a meter, and Gellert Hill dominating this entire urban landscape with its ancient, impregnable citadel, turned each individual residential quarter into an independent, fire-spitting fortress. The defending troops showed incredible ingenuity. They actively and systematically used an extensive kilometer-long network of ancient underground communications, wide sewer collectors, and interconnected deep basements. This allowed them to move tactical reserves completely unnoticed by aviation, suddenly deliver devastating blows to the very rear of advancing assault detachments, and reliably hide from crushing artillery shelling, weathering fire raids deep underground. The specifics of the endless street battles practically nullified the overwhelming advantage of Soviet troops in heavy armored vehicles and air support. Huge tanks trapped in the narrow stone corridors of the streets, deprived of freedom of maneuver, became an easy, defenseless target for anti-tank guns and enemy soldiers armed with handheld grenade launchers, carefully camouflaged in basement windows. The global confrontation of armies broke down into thousands of scattered, localized, but no less brutal clashes for individual multi-story buildings, dark stairwells, tram depots, and factory workshops. Specially formed assault groups literally had to gnaw their way through, blasting through thick walls between adjacent buildings with explosives to advance through dust and soot, avoiding going out into open squares and intersections which were completely, to the millimeter, covered by experienced snipers and machine gun crews. The dynamics of daily progress were no longer measured in kilometers, but in pitiful tens of meters per day. In these unbearable conditions, the losses of advancing units inevitably and rapidly increased, which required continuous replenishment with manpower and colossal efforts from commissars to maintain a high level of motivation among personnel who were in a state of severe psychological stress and physical exhaustion from constant sleep deprivation and cold. The external perimeter of this grandiose conflict, meanwhile, was heating up to the limit. The German High Command, fully aware of the scale of the impending strategic catastrophe threatening the entire front in the event of the inevitable fall of the Hungarian capital, undertook 3 desperate, large-scale attempts to relieve the garrison surrounded on all sides. These operations went down in history under the ominous code name Conrad. To implement these ambitious plans, selected elite tank units fully equipped with the latest, heaviest armored vehicles were hastily transferred from other, no less important sectors of the front. The blows of these armored fists were delivered with astonishing, blind force and the tenacity of the doomed. At certain, most critical moments of the January battles, German tank wedges managed to break through the outer ring of Soviet defense and approach the snow-covered outskirts of besieged Budapest to a distance of less than 30 kilometers. The city's defenders, trapped in the ruins, could clearly hear the heavy, reassuring cannonade of their comrades' large-caliber guns, desperately coming to their aid. These powerful counterattacks forced the Soviet command to hastily divert significant, fresh forces directly from the assault on the city blocks to hold and strengthen the outer ring of encirclement. This circumstance further prolonged the agonizing process of finally capturing the capital and, paradoxically, indirectly confirmed in the eyes of the Moscow leadership the main thesis of the Marshal's staff about the incredible, unpredictable complexity of the task assigned to him. Nevertheless, despite fanatical resistance, the defending group's resource potential inexorably, hour by hour, decreased to a critical level. The enormous garrison was supplied exclusively by air, using transport aviation, but Soviet anti-aircraft artillery, which tightly encircled the city, and constantly patrolling fighter aircraft, quickly established absolute control over the airspace. Heavy, unwieldy transport aircraft suffered catastrophic losses attempting to break through to cargo drop zones. The volumes of delivered containers, ammunition, food rations, and vital medicines fatally lagged behind the minimal, basic needs of the encircled troops. Inside the freezing city, a severe humanitarian and logistical collapse rapidly brewed. All remaining rear area supplies were completely exhausted. Power lines and water pipes were destroyed by bombing, and control over the situation in panic-stricken areas was gradually lost. By mid-January, after bloody battles for every block, the left bank flat Pest was completely cleared of enemy forces. Desperate remnants of German-Hungarian troops retreated under cover of darkness across the historic bridges over the icy Danube to the mountainous, more defensible Buda. Immediately thereafter, the crossings, which were of immense architectural value, were mercilessly blown up by retreating sappers, forever cutting off their last escape routes. The lives of the civilian population during these weeks turned into an unending, hopeless nightmare of subterranean existence. Hundreds of thousands of civilians, old people, women, children, found themselves trapped in dark, damp basements without light, heat, or the slightest hope of quick deliverance. The water supply was not functioning, and people had to venture to the surface under cover of night, risking being hit by a stray bullet or shell fragment, to collect dirty snow or try to get water from frozen city fountains and broken pipes. Food supplies ran out in the first weeks of the blockade. Hunger pushed people to extreme measures. All stray animals disappeared from the streets, and later the inhabitants of the famous capital zoo met the same fate of being eaten. In this atmosphere of total despair and animal fear, armed patrols of the ___quote__0__ party roamed the ruins. These detachments, consisting of radically inclined youth, administered swift and brutal justice to all suspected of disloyalty, desertion, or attempts at concealment. Thousands of innocent people were led to the embankments of the freezing Danube, where their lives tragically ended in the icy waters of the river, leaving behind only a mournful memory and empty shoes on the snow-covered granite. It was during this period of the garrison's internal agony that the internal administrative conflict in the staff echelons of the Soviet troops reached its highest. Critical point of tension. Field intelligence continued to regularly report the real, deplorable state of affairs. The garrison was extremely exhausted, its combat strength rapidly, catastrophically decreasing due to daily losses in street fights, frostbite, and epidemics. Many hastily assembled Hungarian units were completely demoralized, abandoning positions and ready to lay down their arms at the first opportunity. However, the officially declared and highest-level approved figure of almost 200,000 encircled enemies continued to weigh like an invisible, heavy burden on all strategic planning. If it were suddenly admitted that the enormous city was being defended with its last strength by only a miserable remnant of the actual 70,000, then in Moscow an inevitable, formidable question would arise. Why could such a colossal, well-equipped grouping of Soviet troops not break the resistance of such insignificant, bloodless forces for so long, suffering enormous losses? The inertia of a large-scale disinformation campaign, once launched, demanded its constant, methodical maintenance by any means necessary. Dispatches to the capital continued to describe the grandiose, epic scale of an unprecedented confrontation with a giant enemy army. A monumental canvas of battle was being created in which the constant delays appeared as an entirely inevitable consequence of the incredible scale of enemy resistance and the genius of enemy engineers. The climax of this historical drama arrived in the frosty February of 1945. The defenders of Buda finally pressed against the frozen river, exhausted to the limit and deprived of any, even spectral, hope of external salvation after the ultimate failure of their allies' last relief operation, undertook a desperate, suicidal attempt to break through. On the dark night of February 12th, the remnants of the combat-ready garrison, concentrated in the narrow alleys near the ruined royal palace, attempted to break through solid Soviet positions in a northwesterly direction. It was a terrifying, silent movement of doomed people through deep snow. Radios were broken, heavy weapons abandoned due to lack of fuel. Only a few small, scattered groups, totaling less than 1,000 people, miraculously managed to seep through the dense combat formations of Soviet blocking detachments, overcome the wooded hills, and reach the positions of the German army. The main, multi-thousand-strong mass of those breaking through was quickly discovered, stopped by a barrage of artillery fire, and completely scattered in the snow-covered suburbs of the city, suffering a crushing defeat. The commander-in-chief of the defense, General Karl Pfeffer Wildenbruch, left his deep underground bunker through a sewage collector, but was soon discovered and detained by Soviet patrols. Organized, centralized resistance completely ceased. The smoking, ruined city finally came under the full control of the advancing armies. And it was at this moment of silence, when the roar of artillery subsided and the gunpowder smoke dissipated, that the most dramatic, cynical, and paradoxical phase of this story unfolded, revealing the ruthless essence of the giant bureaucratic machine of wartime. When the meticulous calculation of the final results of the long operation began, the front headquarters faced an insurmountable, catastrophic mathematical problem. According to all official reports previously sent to the headquarters, 188,000 first-class trained enemy soldiers were in the encirclement. During many days of bloody battles, according to the bravura reports of the same headquarters, only a certain, logically justified part of them was irrevocably put out of action. Accordingly, for the paper balance to converge, the number of captured prisoners of war at the end of the assault should have been many, many tens of thousands. However, the harsh reality was that the actual number of surrendered exhausted soldiers, even taking into account all the scattered Hungarian formations that found themselves at the bottom of this cauldron, was critically small and absolutely, under no circumstances, corresponded to the previously declared epic scale of the defeated giant grouping. To send a telegram to Moscow with the real, modest figures of those captured meant voluntarily admitting to months of systematic lies, publicly acknowledging a grandiose information falsification, and thereby putting all the highest command of the front under imminent threat, up to execution articles. It was urgently necessary by any means to eliminate this egregious documentary imbalance, which threatened disaster for the generals' careers. The decision, coldly made in cozy headquarters to urgently cover the resulting shortage of prisoners of war, forever became one of the darkest, most tragic pages in the history of the post-war arrangement. So that the final dry figures in the reports would perfectly match the previously declared fantastic data, the surviving civilian population of ruined Budapest began to be massively and indiscriminately sent to filtration camps for prisoners of war. Men of conscription age, teenagers, and even old men who had absolutely no connection to the armed forces or politics were detained directly on the debris-strewn streets, forcibly extracted from basements where they had sought shelter from continuous bombings, and hastily, without any investigation, registered as enemy soldiers captured with weapons in hand. This operation received the bitter popular name ___, quote, _0___. Under the pretext of clearing rubble, people were led away forever. Tens of thousands of civilians in the Hungarian capital who miraculously survived the nightmare of a multi-day bloody siege, overnight, by a stroke of a staff clerk's pen, turned into disenfranchised statistical material, vitally necessary to save the high positions and careers of Soviet military leaders. They were hastily loaded into freight cars and sent deep into the rear, to harsh labor camps in the vast territory of the Soviet Union. Many of these accidental victims of the bureaucratic machine spent long, grueling years in captivity, paying with their health and broken destinies for someone else's cynical staff lie. And only in this inhumane way was the strict paper reporting of the Second Ukrainian Front finally brought into perfect, impeccable order, fully, down to the last person, confirming for historians the beautiful legend of a grandiose, hard-won victory over a colossal, unyielding enemy army. This historical episode reveals to us the deepest, frightening paradox of the functioning of totalitarian control systems. In conditions where objective truth is rigidly subordinated to current political expediency, and the animal fear of superior, unforgiving leadership paralyzes the will, information distortion becomes not just a possible deviation, but a systemically necessary norm of survival. The lie of Marshal Malinovsky and his entourage was not an isolated act of malice or a manifestation of personal cruelty. It became an absolutely rational, predictable response of intelligent people to the irrational, detached from reality demands of a rigid system that did not tolerate objective difficulties and delays. Experienced generals, planning fateful large-scale operations, paradoxically find themselves in the deafening captivity of their own forcibly inflated obligations. They are forced to step by step construct a convenient virtual reality, consisting of inflated figures and non-existent armies, which gradually, inexorably, replaces the physical reality occurring in the trenches. And the most terrible, most tragic thing in this well-oiled mechanism of lies is that for the comfortable adjustment of staff maps in warm offices and the perfect alignment of statistical indicators, simple people on the ground always, without exception, pay. These are soldiers who are blindly thrown into unprepared, suicidal offensives for the sake of meeting deadlines. And these are civilians who are coldly turned into faceless numbers to close gaps in reporting. Today, decades later, impartially analyzing the yellowed documents of that harsh era, we clearly see the very process of how an unshakable historical myth is formed and cemented. Official state historiography confidently broadcasted for long decades data on the heroic capture of an enormous 180,000-strong grouping in Budapest, reliably cementing this inflated figure in school textbooks, monumental encyclopedias, and military commanders' memoirs. The scale of this victory, artificially created on paper, flawlessly served the goals of post-war propaganda, vividly demonstrating to the whole world the indomitable titanic might of the advancing army, capable of grinding such armadas. Only the fall of ideological barriers, the opening of secret military archives, and a scrupulous, independent count of the real forces actually involved on both sides in that battle allowed historians to destroy this monumental, blood-built construct and show society the true, frightening cost of this long siege. The lessons of these distant events are crystal clear and do not lose their acute relevance even today. Absolute monopoly on information and the absence of mechanisms for independent, objective control inevitably lead to large-scale data manipulation at all levels of state administration. When the personal fear of the executor of imminent punishment far exceeds the value of reliable, honest information, the system begins to rapidly blind itself. It makes fateful decisions based on its own fictitious premises and fabricated reports, which ultimately, sooner or later, leads to catastrophic, irreparable consequences and completely unjustified losses of colossal resources and priceless human lives. Returning to that very tense phone conversation which took place in the deep autumn of 1944, one can state with full confidence that it was at that elusive moment when an uncompromising order for the immediate capture of the city was given in a quiet Kremlin office that the invisible mechanism of the future grandiose falsification was already irreversibly launched. The Marshal, coolly accepting for immediate execution a knowingly impossible strategic directive, made his difficult, conscious choice between professional officers' honesty and his own physical survival in the ruthless, man-grinding system of absolute power. Budapest, turned into ruins, eventually fell. The main strategic goal of the campaign was formally achieved, and the direct path to Vienna was open. Victors, as the well-known historical rule cynically states, are not judged, and smooth staff reports with impeccable, though completely fabricated arithmetic formed the solid foundation of victorious dispatches and award sheets. But deep beneath the thickness of these official, verified documents, glorifying unparalleled military genius, the true, unseemly mechanisms of decision-making remained forever hidden. There lies the exorbitant price of the General Staff's bureaucratic illusions and the silent, mutilated fates of tens of thousands of those who, by a cruel twist of fate, became pawns and hostages of this grandiose staff deception, designed only to justify the prolonged, agonizing overcoming of the impregnable barriers of the Hungarian capital.